Hello, and welcome to the mentorDINO podcast. I'm your host, Katelyn Rossier. I am an architect and founder of mentorDINO. Join me each week as I speak with amazing professionals in and around the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, as we are all part of a larger interconnected community. We discuss everything from career stories, lessons learned, and advice for others finding their own unique career path. Thank you to all of our current subscribers, and if you're new, welcome to the conversation. And if you like this episode, please do me a favor by hitting subscribe, like, or share it with a friend. It really helps others be able to discover this resource and support them on their own unique career journey. Welcome to this week's episode of the mentorDINO podcast. I would like to welcome Janki DePalma, Director of Business Development at W.E. O'Neill Construction in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Janki, for taking the time to speak with me today.
It is an honor. Thanks for asking me.
And it was a pleasure to meet you in person first, because we met at the AIA Women's Leadership Summit out in Chicago in this past 2024, because your episode will come out in 2025. And so I got to learn a little bit about you and what you've been working on the business development side. But if you don't mind introducing yourself to my listeners to let them know a little bit about your experience and journey so far in your education and career.
Sure. Yeah, it was actually wonderful to meet you in person. I've been following you for a long time, so it was like a celebrity sighting when we got to meet up. So my name is Janki, and I am the Business Development Director at W.E. O'Neill Construction. I am leading their Texas office. I'm based in Austin, and I have been involved in the marketing and business development for AEC, architect, engineer, construction firms, for a little over 20 years. I started off in marketing, and then I went into business development, and I have spent the bulk of my career in business development, and most of that has been in Austin, although I did grow up in San Francisco, which is where I started my career. Let's see, in terms of my education, I went to the University of California, Davis, go Aggies, and I have a dual degree in comparative literature and Japanese. And I don't really use the Japanese at all. The comparative literature does help with writing, which I do quite a bit, although that is not really part of my day job. My main focus is to develop and build relationships and help grow our company.
Yeah. So how was the shift from the marketing side to business development? Because typically when I think of marketing, I think of more like making the physical proposals or helping out with branding for the office, whereas BD is more that relationship building.
Yes, it's very astute. Mine came as a very happenstance sort of situation. Basically, I had always been marketing, and when I first started, I was in companies that had more of like either a doer seller, where the person who was like the main, like the principal or the founder was kind of winning the work, or they had these dedicated business development executives in key offices, which weren't the offices I was in. So that was not something I had seen. I had sort of delved into it slightly when I was in San Francisco. I was working at a construction company, and I had noticed that our proposals were slowing down, and I needed to stay busy. And we just had a new principal that moved in, and I figured, well, what I could do is at least start introducing him to counterparts within the industry. So I had friends who worked at architecture firms or engineering firms, and I would sort of put these meetings together because I wanted to, stay active and basically, not be caught twiddling my thumbs because there's nothing legitimately for me to work on. And I think I had experienced some layoffs early in my career. So trying to seem valuable and, being a person who could like address a problem was always something I figured would help keep me safe. So that's kind of how it started. And in the same way, that's how it started when we moved to Austin. I was laid off from a architecture firm that I was working at very part-time doing marketing. And I had just pitched this idea of business development. And luckily, a friend of mine had introduced me to her husband, who had started the Austin office of a structural engineering firm. And I pitched this BD concept, which was supposed to last for 2 months as like a temp thing. And I stayed there for 12 years. And helped them.
Temporary 12
no big
years.
deal. Yeah, 12 years. And so then I helped them grow their Austin office and also helped start their Denver office and do some corporate initiatives too. But it all kind of happened. I sort of fell into that. It wasn't something that I even knew existed. It just, right place, right time.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned being laid off, and I know, the architects and interior designers, engineers, we're always worried when, recessions hit, but we're primarily billable. And that's very different than marketing and business development. That tends to be a lot more overhead. What's a recession in the AEC industry like when you're mainly overhead? I don't know if you have any advice for.
So it depends on the firm, right? So I would, one thing I would petition is for us not to be considered overhead, but more operations, because we're kind of doing all the work that feeds the beast, right? Keeps the machine going. So, but I think forward-thinking firms see the role of marketing, business development as an investment, right? If you are low on work, you need people to help you get more work. That's one school of thought. There's another school of thought that says, hey, when we're struggling, we need to get rid of anyone who's not immediately generating dollars. So it sort of depends on how it is. I think a lot has changed in the industry, but there are a lot of people who are, who've experienced that situation where, where firms have to make a tough call and they decide that it's the call is to get rid of the people who can help them grow.
Yeah. And I've seen firms take very different approaches between, hey, let's keep billable staff, to, hey, this project went on hold, let's let go of the entire project team because they don't have anything, or getting rid of higher level staff because they're more expensive, or lower level staff because it's more time to train them, even though they're cheaper. There's so many different facets that I usually tell people not to worry about it because you can't control it.
I think that is a very interesting piece of advice. It's like you really can't future-proof your job, no matter how much you think you are, because you don't really know what's happening in those closed-door meetings about where they're going to make the investment and what choices they're going to make. And I think it's a really key lesson, wherever you are in your career, that you can only control what you can control.
Yeah. And just try to be helpful and valuable, and
while keeping your sanity and maintaining boundaries and all those kind of good things, right?
Sanity is the hard part.
Boundaries are the tougher one for me, but
and I know, so you've done business development on an engineering side, an architecture side, and now the contractor side. So you've been on so many different angles of the industry. So how does everything kind of tie together for you in those relationships? Because we all work together on projects. So what's it like on your end?
I mean, it's funny because a lot of people would ask me that, because I spent most of my time on the design side, right? So consultant and then architect. And it's still the same thing. We're all working together to get a project done, right? In most cases, build a building, right? So all you're doing in business development is building and maintaining relationships. And ultimately, people want to work with people that they know, like, and trust. And my role is to help kind of move people along that way, because it gets really easy to get caught up in sort of the minutia of the actual project, like when you're in the trenches, and then forget that, oh yeah, we actually like these people and we all want to go home. I mean, most of us want to be able to be proud of a project. I think that is really yes, billables count and, making a profit count, but ultimately we all want to be able to point to a project and tell someone we care about that we worked on it. And that's kind of what we all, as a collective want. So that's something I think is really important to always keep in mind, that even when we're kind of, in the throes of a difficult part of the project, like in CA, or you're trying to VE a project or something like that, you're ultimately trying to get the same thing. trying to find a win-win situation. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to do, is to kind of smooth the process during, and then help obviously in the early stages to help, identify and create those relationships.
Yeah. So if I think of the life of a project, so the design team tends to start a lot earlier than the contractor, for the most part, if you think of it commercial wise. Where does BD happen within that kind of timeline?
I think everyone wants to be further left, right? Yep. In the continuum. Like, you want to, as an architect, you want to get in early. Everyone wants to get in earlier. The contractor wants to get in early. I love it if we can get in when the project is just a glimmer in somebody's eyes, right? Because then we can give input and ideas and help people live in reality. So for BD, that's the same thing. I mean, you want to be making relationships early, before people might even, ideally even before they're thinking about the project, because we want to build relationships, not chase projects.
Yep.
And I think that's a really key differentiator, is that you're not looking at let's say a school district and waiting for them to be, going after a bond and then because they're going to do a $200 million high school. You want to be part of that team way before, and helping them in all kinds of ways. So you're doing a lot of projects for that district, right? Or for a developer or anything like that. So that, as early as possible, you really, I think the best things are the ones where it's a relationship where maybe somebody was, an architect, and then they left architecture and went to become a developer. And then they still remember how great it was to interact with us as people, and they call on us because they're thinking about it. They're pulling together their squad of helpers.
Yeah, and building out to relationships rather than just sending out a blanket
all about
RFP sometimes.
It's all relationships. It's all it is. Think about it. If you're going to do something tough, you're going to pull together the people you trust who are going to help you. They're going to tell you what's going to bite you in the behind. They're going to take this as seriously as you take it, right? They're going to be kind, but tell you the truth, right? Think about anything you're doing in your life. So it's the same thing, whether you're a developer, whether you're a school district, whatever it is, you want to gather people who are going to tell you all the things that you don't know.
Exactly. And speaking of that, I know when I started my career, I had no idea the business development world even existed. And we had a business development person in the office, and it was what does he do? He's off in his office, he's on calls, but you don't really learn the business side of architecture in architecture school. So it is, what are you doing? What's going on? So do you have a good way of explaining what business development is and what that role is to recent grads?
We talk about this a lot for some of the mentoring I do with either students, either in high school when I helped with ACE mentors, or there's a college series that I help with for the Austin AIA Women in Architecture. And I guess I'll mix a lot of metaphors, but basically sometimes what business development is doing is helping move people through that continuum, right? Do they know us? Do they like us? And do they trust us? And I think a lot of that is a bit now here's where the mixing of metaphors comes in. Think of me like a personal trainer. You may have the discipline to do your workout and all the reps and, hit your goals. And that's great. And that is what a traditional doer seller was. And I think that's the model that a lot of us grew up with. A lot of times the name partners were doing that, right? Because they eat what they kill. So they are hustling and doing things. And then as a firm gets bigger, people just get really into their project, which is great. They're doing the work they're paid for, but do you have the time and thoughtfulness to create a plan to reach out to your current clients, the people who you might have fallen off with, they're not current, but they know you, and new people? And sometimes you do, or sometimes, in that same metaphor, you're like me and you look up and you're like, oh my goodness, it's 10:30 at night and I forgot to work out. right? I guess I'll do it tomorrow. So it's the same thing. Like, do you have time? It may not happen unless you have someone who is there to like map that out for you. And that's where an in-house BD person comes in, because we're full-time doing this. And then we also create avenues where we can bring in people so we can, tag team, when it's appropriate. So it's not all on you trying to squeeze it in along with like a full day job.
Yeah. Is there that right balance of when you go to an event or meeting with a client versus when you bring along a principal to come with you to balance that?
I mean, it all depends, right? It all depends. I had started my career in a place that was very focused on utilization rates. So I'm always like really hyper cognizant of like, I don't want to waste your time, like let me, meet these people first and then bring you. But I'm changing a little bit because I realize that sometimes people want to come with and go through the whole process and see, and see that. And it sometimes can be a fun balance of, somebody who's very technical, who all they really want to do is talk about, like when I work with architects, like, quickly do like a massing diagram or like really dive into the weeds of something like on an engineering or construction side. And then someone like me who's more relationship oriented. So I will be talking more about like the person and what they're into and sort of the motivation of where this project might be coming. I will not be diving into the weeds about like what structural system to use, even though I know what they are, but that's not my jam. Like I'm going to be talking much more about who they are and connecting with them. So it kind of depends, if a person wants to do it, sometimes they don't have time. So I'll take like a first meeting and then do a follow up and say, hey, we really want to talk about, like we just had this the other day where I had a meeting and the person is doing wood frame construction, which can have like, which looks fairly straightforward, but it can have some implications, if you don't have the right trade partners. And so I set up a meeting with the principal and said, hey, let's have breakfast with him because we can talk about this. Like you could talk specifically about things with trade partners, with framers, sequencing, really get kind of nitty gritty because that's kind of what this guy needed to hear. And then I also knew, just kind of moving the relationship along, right? That's kind of what I'm doing.
Yeah, but also giving them enough information to have awareness of what they're walking into of, hey, this client's has some questions on these components. So
like
then
you
the
can
person
nerd
can be
out
prepared.
about this, right? Or there's times when we are having a first meeting and I'll say, okay, we're going to pull back. Like the goal of this meeting is like just for them to get to know you. So we're not going to do a heavy sales about, how many billions of dollars of work we do per year, how many offices. We're going to pull back a little and you kind of want to just find points of connection. So you realize that you guys live in the same neighborhood, have kids the same age or whatever it is. And you're both Aggies or whatever it is here in Texas, right?
Yeah. So do you have any advice for those more mid-career senior professionals that are starting to dive in more into business development and how to maybe improve their skills if they're just on the technical side, but need to build the relationship side?
Yeah. A couple things. One of my very, very favorite books is one called Captivate by the author. Her name is Vanessa Van Edwards. It is a book I have used extensively, and I often use it like for book clubs and stuff like that. She's a social scientist. She has a YouTube channel called The Science of People, I think is it. And she calls herself a recovering awkward person. So she has looked at the science of how people connect. And the book itself is divided into 3 sections, and it's connecting in the first, 5 minutes, 5 hours, and 5 days. So it kind of talks about different ways of connecting, and she breaks down a lot of interesting things. I love that book very much. But so sometimes it's always fun to read something and talk about. But in terms of what I've seen in the industry, I think a lot of times mid-career professionals feel a lot of pressure to, build a book of business. And that's sometimes something the firm will require, like once you hit like a certain point, like once you become an associate or an associate principal. And kind of like you said, like they've had no training, right? You just know how to be a really good practitioner. And you sort of feel this sense that, relationships are linear. So it's like, I took you out to lunch. So at the end of the lunch, I need to have something to report, right? Like did you get me a project, or do you even have the need for a engineer, architect, builder, or whatever? And I kind of take it a step back and say, think about like how you make friends in general. Think about like how you made friends with someone in, like an English class you took in college, right? Or somebody at church, or somebody at your kickball league, or whatever it is you do, like mom friend, however you make friends. It's not about that. You're just finding points of connection. So you might be asking a lot of questions. I think that people like talking about themselves, which is what I think you do very well with this podcast, right? Like you make
it's
people talk.
Very easy.
It's just like, yeah. So I think in a way, for people who feel more introverted, this is perfect, because all you have to do is listen. So just ask a couple questions and and have some good questions. And that book gives some really good questions. And then you can look at that and see, how does that, like, where are the points of connection? The biggest thing that I like is you're trying to get yourself from going from a complete stranger to less of a stranger. So you're trying to find some yes ands, like, oh, I also have this, like, we also have this friend in common, or I also am in this part of town, or whatever it is that helps,
Yeah.
So that's what I would say, is to pull away that pressure. Yeah, there's a lot of performance anxiety around BD. Like you go to a BD, like a networking event. There's a lot of pressure that you should walk away with, 10 business cards or this and this. And so it's like, if you remove some of that pressure and just show up, and maybe also learn your thrive zones. Like some people, I've realized this, that I really thrive on one-to-one conversations. And once I've given myself the permission to do that and not necessarily work a room, I actually have like a greater impact. So I just have like a couple good conversations with someone, like at the side of the happy hour or whatever. And then I can like pull away, and I don't have to be there until it closes. I could just stay a couple hours or even an hour. Right. So I think that's what I would do, is say, like, my goal is to deepen relationships. And that also is a depth versus a breadth. So you don't have to meet 200 people. You could just meet like 5 people and then continue with them, right? Like find a way to continue reaching out to them. I would usually tell my mid-career professionals the easiest thing to start is the people at the OAC meeting. like maybe take them to lunch or breakfast or coffee, come a little early, chat with them outside of the project. Like you're not talking about the actual drawings, but you're getting to know you're like your counterpart, right? Like the structural engineer, the MEP, whatever. Just get to know them as people a little bit. You already are working on a project. So I would say that those are easy avenues to sort of start developing deeper relationships.
Yeah. And there's a lot of hidden things that we do as the design team that can help business development. So I find, if I'm in a user group meeting, I want to ask very open-ended questions because I want to learn the why and get the story behind something, and not yes or no questions, because a yes, I can have different assumptions to it. And it's a lot like coming up with questions to ask my guests on the podcast. I didn't know you got laid off from firms. And, nobody says, hey, I got laid off at this time. If I'm searching on LinkedIn or somebody's company website, those other things that make us human aren't always listed somewhere for somebody to find. But if you can ask the right questions, you can dive deeper. So as much as we get more reasoning for design, that actually helps me on the podcast side and business development and working a room.
Oh, I think especially as designers, because I feel like, no shade to any other discipline, but like a lot of what you're doing is creating spaces for people, right? And how do people connect to the space? So it's not just a box, right? All those decisions help like change not only the facade of a building, but also how people interact with the building in terms of the exterior and interior, right? Like all that stuff is very well thought out, and that is done through asking a ton of questions. So it's the same thing. Like you're just asking questions, interested. It helps if you can find ways to remember. So if you have like a CRM and you dump that information, I'm just really good at remembering things. So I will remember like little details. I don't remember everything, but I'll remember enough details. I think ultimately people want to feel memorable. So if you can remember something about them, then you just feel like, oh, okay, you did, I'm not just forgettable. And I think people just want to be heard, right?
Yeah. I'm always taking notes on business cards. I actually had somebody, the previous WLS I went to, wrote like an impactful statement on her business card that she gave to me. And I remember that. It was just very different. And I was like, oh, okay, I remember the table I was talking at. I remember the discussion we were talking about. And just that little touch helped make a memory for me.
How do you find other points of connecting? So if you're at a conference, like, talking to the people next to you or, talking to the speaker and all these kind of things, right? You're just finding more points to connect.
Yeah. And it's always good to take a break. I always let my introverted friends know I am partially introverted. So when I go to a big event, sometimes I just need to step away, or I'll like go take a bathroom break when I don't actually need to go to the bathroom. I just need to like mentally breathe. But sometimes that's when you meet people you weren't expecting. Like I took a break at AI National and I'm like, I just want to go sit over here, but there weren't many seats. So I sat near somebody else. I had no idea who they were. And I ended up having a one-on-one conversation. And I was like, oh, okay. Like I wasn't expecting to have a conversation. I needed a break, but like getting to a one-on-one scale is a break for me rather than like a big group setting of a giant conference. So you never know when a break will turn into a really awesome
so many things. Like one, I think the break is very valid because I feel like a lot of times you're at a conference and you feel that it feels like you're back in high school where the conference starts at 8 and ends at 6, and therefore you are like required to attend the whole thing. And it took me years to realize that I need to go when I am at my best self, which sometimes most likely is not at 7:30 in the morning. So I sometimes don't go to that first thing because it's like, I'm not going to be at my best self then if I feel like that, or I will give myself breaks. But it's interesting you mentioned the restroom because there is this big event in Austin. It is this big gala. And it's like the 2,000 people. And I'd say it's probably like 85% guys. And it can be overwhelming because everyone's like dressed up. So all the guys are in tuxedos, and it's kind of unnerving to try to remember somebody contextually sometimes because they're now in a tuxedo. You see them on a job site or something. But I will often go to the ladies' room and then end up having a great time because I'll run into a bunch of people, a bunch of women I know, and it's at like a smaller setting and you're a little bit pulled away. And then I'll end up like, spending like 20 minutes chatting at the sink with a bunch of people. And it's just like a different pace. But I think ultimately goes back to the point you made about like the self-awareness you have of when are you at your best self? When are you overwhelmed? When do you need to recharge? And that's valid. Like some people will work a room and go to like 3 after parties. That's never going to be me. And I don't have to shapeshift. The older I got, the less I've been shapeshifting. And I think that is the only thing that's really sustainable, right? Is like being your authentic self.
Yeah. And when it's fine not to attend one part of it and it's okay. Or
you could leave.
Jump around.
Yeah. Take a break. Go make a pretend phone call. Do whatever you need to do, right?
Exactly. But I wanted to jump into other organizations you've been involved in, because I know you've been heavily involved in SMPS, so the Society of Marketing Professional Services, over the years, and you were the 2023 president for the Austin chapter. So what all are you doing over at SMPS, and do you have any exciting things that you were able to accomplish in 2023?
So technically I was the chapter president for 21-22. I was the 2023 chapter president of the year. So I was the president of the Austin chapter, and then they give an award for all like the top president nationally. And so I was the recipient of that in 23. So I was the national chapter president of the year. Yes, I love SMPS. It's a great organization. It's probably the longest relationship I've ever had aside from my husband. I've been, it's a great place. I think it is so underrated. Most people think it's for marketing coordinators and BD people. It is in a professional development way, but I think it is the number one place if you have to do any type of marketing or business development in the professional services industry. It is the place to go because they will teach you things on both marketing, business development. They do like research, and like there's this whole research that they've been doing with like the neuroscience of selling. You can really like nerd out on like how people make decisions and kind of use that information. I think it's a great organization. I just recently became a fellow. So I finished my chapter presidency, and then I applied for fellowship. So I became a fellow in 24. So I'm still sort of, helping out with the Austin chapter. We have an amazing chapter, so they don't really need my help with anything. But I also help right now with there's like a regional conference. I kind of help with that. And there's a couple other things that I do just to stay involved. But yeah, that's definitely a hardcore investment of mine in terms of my time.
Yeah. So what's the fellowship process for SMPS?
It's like the same thing of being a fellow in AIA. It's just the highest level of like the designation that they have. So there is a long drawn out process. You get letters of recommendation and you write about all the stuff you've done. Basically, it's talking about what you've done in sort of concentric circles of like your chapter to region to national, and then outside of what we call the society. So it's outside of SMPS. Like, are you doing anything else? And then ideally it's your goal is to like, once you become a fellow, you want to like use that platform to do something. So I have this whole thing with, in particular, like, we talked about a little bit about, maintaining your sanity and boundaries when it comes to working. My thing has to do with, I have often earlier and even midway through my career fell into this trap of overproducing in order to be, to be seen as like productive and safe and, ideally hoping that like someone would give me a promotion if I did all things all the time. And so I kind of created this analogy, and I've written about it, and I was able to actually talk about it at the national conference. But it's this analogy of going from like a pack mule to a unicorn. And you start to realize the difference of sort of being the pack mule who just does everything and feels like the only way to show that you have value is by carrying this sort of unsustainably heavy load, to being the unicorn where you really you realize like what it is you have to give and sort of use that to help elevate your firm. And you don't have to overwork yourself, but you can actually add the tremendous value when you begin to see, the problems that your firm might have and how your skill set can actually solve a business problem. So that was kind of like my platform. And so I was very glad to be part of this year's fellows because they are some like amazing people. I know I just squeaked by in this class, but I made it. So I was happy.
Now you're the unicorn blazing through.
Blazing through the pack muleness. Yes.
So I want to dive in a little bit more to what you're explaining with that overproducing and feeling like a pack mule to realizing where your particular unicorn was. So, because I explain it a lot when somebody's going through burnout, that it's hard to know you're burned out because you're a fish in a bowl of water and you don't know that you're in a bowl of water, but somebody outside the bowl of water can see you're clearly in a bowl of water. So how I find that very similar to, if you're overproducing and just trying to prove yourself, how do you realize you're in that state to then reconfigure yourself?
So this is really hard because it is a very seductive cycle. Because when, like, I did a lot of self-analysis. So what happens is like, let's say you're hired, right? And there's a lot of expectations and you're trying to sort of prove to yourself and everyone around you that hiring you was the smartest thing they ever did, right? So you will overproduce. And that's like a natural, especially I think for like, I will say anyone who's part of like the gifted and talented program as a kid will probably fall into this trap. And then what happens is you get a lot of accolades. Like people love this. You're overproducing. What manager doesn't want that, right? So you will get a lot of praise. And so that like starts a cycle. But then what happens is you've inadvertently like now raised the bar of expectation. So what's normal has now been raised tremendously. So now you will constantly be having this, it's almost like a dopamine addiction where you are trying to overproduce in order to get more kudos. And it's not happening. All of a sudden, everything you do is average. And so then you will fall into a couple of like cycles of either you will outwork yourself. Like you were like, I just need to work harder. I got it. Like I will outdo myself. Or you begin to get really depressed and you begin to wonder, what's going on. It's like a myriad, but it's like such a bad cycle to be in. And I think it is really seductive. Like I feel that you need a good manager who can say like, whoa, like you don't need to do this. Like I've noticed you doing this. Like you don't need to be here all weekend. Like this isn't normal. Like we can pull back, but it's hard because I don't think people do it in a malicious way. It's just very easy to take advantage of someone who is actively giving, but you have to that's where the boundaries come in. And I think it's really hard especially as a young person or when you're new in any organization, even if you're not new in your career, boundaries really are a top down thing. And I think it's really unfair to tell a very young person or a person new in an organization to create like hard lines. That's what a manager should be doing, is to sort of protect the long-term investment of you as a professional in that organization and say, okay, you know what? We need to pull back. Like this load is too much. I've noticed she's here over the weekend. That's not necessarily, it's not the ER, right? Nothing we do is saving lives, right? Well, I guess code can be, but like, you know what I mean? It's like, so I think that's where that comes in. So it is really, really difficult. And it is hard. It is hard. I mean, I think what you said is where even when people tell you, you sometimes don't know how to hop off. It's sort of, I think hearing these stories helps because then you realize like, oh, I'm in this cycle. Like, how did I paint myself into a corner again? Where now, no matter what I do, everyone just shrugs their shoulders and goes, yeah, that's what she does. You're kind of, because you're like striving for these, this like external validation, which is so easy to want to have, especially as throughout your career. And I think once you begin to sort of look at things a little differently, sort of realize what are your intrinsic motivations, and then how do you create like boundaries? How can you be okay with, as a kid who maybe always got hundreds, how can you be okay with producing at like an 80% level, which is a sustainable amount, versus like 100, 105%, which is not sustainable over time, but like innately you want to be like the one who got A's, right? I'm sure you were that kid. I was that kid. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I was that kid. So it was.
I was that kid that was not naturally gifted and would kill myself over getting those A's and trying for it, and getting like a low B or C was like death type scenario.
Yeah,
and it's like,
I mean,
a B is perfectly fine.
So it was definitely that. One of the things I admire about my son is he has found a very healthy mindset. I'm very, very proud of him, where he has just been like, I could kind of do a little bit of work and get like a 92. And that's enough. I'm like, don't you want to do that? He's like, I don't have to kill myself for this 8 points. And I was like, wow, like that would drive me nuts when I was in high school. But he has no problem. And it's really, I could see his mental health. It's so much better because who he is isn't dependent upon, like his identity isn't the kid who gets hundreds or the kid who like sets the curve. And in a same way, I think, for us as practitioners, whatever you do, to realize that like you were hired for a certain skill set and you have that. You have nothing to prove. You're just go forward, do your best, but like you don't always have to do extra, because that's actually, like you said, it's burning yourself out. If I don't I have to fill up my car, right, with gas. The car is not doing me any favors by like not letting me fill it up. I will burn out my car, right? So it's the same thing. Like everything needs rest. Everything needs, to pull back a little.
Yeah, because if you're resting and taking breaks, like at a conference, you can be your best self, and then you'll be even better on projects. So I think it's very
and then
important.
There's also so many studies that also show like the human mind, like there's like a productivity threshold. So I think once you hit like 50 hours, like the work you do afterwards is pretty garbage. Like, and so, like a lot of times, like the work product that happens with like an all-nighter or something that's like stretched out over the weekend really isn't your best work. And I think that's really hard, especially for architects, given, like the history of like studio hours in school, where you're just really pushed to see like your level of commitment is based on the number of hours you put into a project. So, I mean, it's a slow changing thing.
Yeah. Like I really don't like when I see senior professionals gloating about all-nighters they're still pulling and lack of sleep. And I'm like, and you're trying to get this next generation to come up and take that leadership role. You're not setting a good example for, I think, the more recent generations that have a little bit more understanding of mental health and the science behind it, and that they don't need to do it. And when they do tell me that they've pulled these crazy all-nighters, then I go in and check for grammar and punctuation mistakes. I always find it. And I am awful at grammar and I am awful at spelling. And so if I'm finding it, I'm like, then you should have slept and it would have been better.
I wrote this article about boundaries, and I ended up actually chatting with a really close friend of mine who I knew from high school. Like we're personal friends, but she has this her job. She works for the state of California. She like oversees attorneys who manage like other attorneys. She's like one of the top people there. But she said that like one of the things she really pays attention to is what you praise. So if anyone worked over the weekend, you do not praise that, because that is a misuse of resources. So you never praise that. Like, you do it, you get those people get paid, and then she'll go back to whoever was the manager and say, kind of like, what did you mismanage here? Because these people shouldn't have been here. And if you're calling a paralegal and a secretary in, like, you better be in too, because there's really nothing they do that needed this use of resources. And I thought it was such an interesting thing, because we inevitably praise the all-nighter, right? And it's sort of this badge of honor when people say they don't sleep. And it is really, I mean, there's been so many studies. Arianna Huffington wrote that book about like how she wasn't sleeping and how like she ended up like actually physically falling asleep and like cutting her cheek open. And she talks about like the importance of sleep in this book. But it's going back to that car analogy. I mean, could you imagine if I bragged about how like I wait until my car is, I consistently drive my car until it's it's on fumes, and then I get gas.
Then you're out pushing the car to the gas station and you're gloating on how you pushed it.
And I never get an oil change. Like you'd be like, what is your problem? And I think it's an interesting generational intersection you're talking about, because one side sees it as a badge of honor and the other side sees this as irresponsible. Right? Like irresponsible, behavior. And then one side sees this quiet quitting or not trying hard enough. And the other group is like, no, I'm doing what I'm paid to do. Like this is part of like the maintenance of a full person, which I'd love to stay at your firm and be a full person. So I don't know. I think it's a very interesting cultural shift that we're having.
Yeah. It'll be I'm curious to see where it goes over the next couple of years.
Yeah, what happens when all these people become managers, and then will they push for that? I think I don't know. I feel it is it's hard to say because sometimes like you have to respond to fires, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like more often than not, the times I have when I look back, it was never necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about the things life is all choices, right? Say yes to something, you say no to something else. The stuff I said no to in order to make a deadline. Now I look back and go, oh, that was a fail. Like I should have said that deadline really didn't matter.
Yeah. Understanding what deadlines matter more than others. Like I'll always push myself a little bit more before a construction documents deadline or a permit set, because that's the final set before it goes to the contractor. I want to put some extra hours because that can save me a lot of money and heartache later.
Right.
But I'm not going to go kill myself over a schematic design deadline. They're going to change it anyway. So get as far as I can within the hours of the day. But it's not pushing myself to those extremes every single week or you're going to get burned out. So
yeah, I think it's a real thing that like we've been talking about a lot in the industry is that burnout, because you are going to have people who realize that they can use their skills and it's not just moving to another firm, but maybe even, leaving the industry if needed. Mm-hmm. And that's, a deficit we don't want to have.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And there's one other program I know you've been working on, or I should say a project, and it's the Zoe Group ElevateHER project.
Oh, yeah.
That I was fascinated with. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're doing with that project initiative?
Yeah, so that was a while ago. So I was part of their inaugural cohort. So ElevateHER is it's like a subsect of Zweig. And what it was started actually with an open letter that the at the time, the CFO, Jamie Claire Kaiser, had written. And it was really all about some of her own sort of like observations of how difficult it can be being a woman in the industry. If she had like this breaking point, and she kind of talks about it. And then because she was part of this big national group that does a lot of thought leadership, as well as helps with like M&A, mergers and acquisitions, a lot of things within the industry, benchmarking and stuff, she was kind of like, why don't we do something about it? So they created this cohort. I think it is must be in its 5th year, because I did it in 2020, which was the inaugural year. And basically, it is a cohort of people from around the country. You apply and you try to tackle a topic that helps elevate women in the industry. And now, because it's been going on for a while, you can either like continue the work of another cohort, or you can start your own project if you want. And it was actually really fun. So the year we did it, we started in, I want to say our first meeting was in the middle of February 2020, and then COVID hit right after. So it was like everything went virtual. And our year, we ended up creating a set of action cards, which got actually created. And these were like talking cards that a manager could use in either a group setting or one-on-one to help increase employee engagement. So they were like based on certain topics, and they were all like data driven, and kind of talked about, it was just a way to sort of see, one, to connect with people, in a personal way, but also sort of talk about like, what are some of the challenges people are having? How can the company address them? And it sort of allowed it to be a little bit more organic than just these like, group rap sessions or forced family fun. That's never really, really fun. So it was a really interesting way to look at, in particular, how to increase the role and of women in our industry. So yeah, it was one of the highlights of my career. It was a fun cohort to be a part of,
and interesting timing with it too, because COVID kind of turned everything upside down. So trying to keep people engaged whenever everything was shifting around. If you were pretty much 100% in person, and a few people were doing the remote aspects. So that's very interesting to have to do
I think it did. And then I think
it
also was an interesting thing to see sort of like where the mental load, especially of like childcare and child rearing education, the care of the home, like how that fell in many cases, like, who's carrying that burden? A lot of women carried that burden. And how was that shown during COVID, where, like maybe it wasn't a big deal when everybody was at school, but all of a sudden this lockdown, like how are you functioning as a professional as well as doing all those things for your family and stuff?
Yeah.
So it was really good. It was excellent. And then I was lucky enough to continually write for Zweig. So I write for them on a quarterly basis just for their newsletter, but it's usually some topic that's like tinkering around in my head.
Yeah. Another fun way to just play around. So.
Yes, definitely.
And I always like wrapping up my podcast with this final question. And
Sure.
it's, what advice do you have for young professionals just starting their career?
Ooh. Okay. So there's always, I naturally am always a big relationship person. So I will say, like, get your relationships and document them. So like for my son, he's 19, I immediately was like, you need to link in with people right away. Cause, and it was just kind of weird because I feel like his generation is not into LinkedIn, and I was kind of forcing him to do it. So, I mean, I would definitely say that relationships are such a key thing because they're kind of like compound interest, like the people you knew when you were, 23, 24, later on, like you're all like growing together in your career. So I would always try to like in some way stay as like connected as possible, even if you leave firms is one thing I would say. But, the biggest one I would say, which was for me, like the big aha, like thing that if I could tell everybody is really sort of like getting much more self-awareness, through like, about like either through reading, maybe like personality tests, like journaling, whatever it is, to really begin to look at like what your strengths are and identify what your sort of like what you do that's fantastic. Because I spent so much of my life and so much of my career trying to convince like 5 random guys who are part of a management team who didn't even live in my city that what I did had value. And I was leaning in and documenting and doing all the stuff that all the business books say to do. But ultimately, if someone can't understand what you do and see its value, they will never, like, you can't change that. I think it cut out.
You're back now.
I'm back now. So what was the last thing I said?
Because you were going over the aha moment.
Oh yeah, I'll just say it again and get podcasts to like, okay. So my big aha moment really had to do with self-awareness and understanding what it is that you do that is unique to you and important. And I had spent so much of my time like knocking myself out to get validation, from other people. Like, like it was always like 5 guys, part of a management committee in a city that I wasn't even in, who had autonomy over my career. And I was spending all my time trying to lean in and document and show them that what I did had value. And ultimately, like, I wish that I knew intrinsically that like, I know what I'm doing and these are the things I'm really good at. Now, can I get better? Definitely. But do I need this guy in another city to validate me? Not necessarily. And sometimes you got to know like when to hop off a merry-go-round. Like sometimes you are never going to, like, it is just not a fit. And a lot of times our culture pushes the sense of grit, and like you can just document and convince someone that you have value. And I wish I had just learned a lesson, like, I don't know, sometimes like someone just can't see it. Mm-hmm. And if you know it's there, there's a part in my talk where I quote Elle Woods in Legally Blonde, where she, then you've seen the movie, right? So,
yep.
Where she's looking at Warner and she's in the bunny costume. She's talking about working hard to get this internship. And he looks at her and he's like, you're never going to get that. And then she has this like pivotal aha moment where she goes, I'm never going to be good enough for you, am I? And that is where in the movie, she moves from her extrinsic motivation, which is to win this guy back, to an intrinsic motivation, which is to like find her calling in this law school. And you see her and you identify what her calling is. You see it played out throughout the rest of the movie. And that is what I want. Like, I would be hands down, that is the gift I would give every single person, is to figure out like what it is you do really well and know when someone doesn't see it, and sometimes you can't convince them, and just be like, you know what, I know who I am. And I think that is, I wish I learned that lesson when I was like 23. I wish I learned it when I was 33.
As much as we talked about relationships and how important it is important to know that it's not going to work for everybody. You're not going to be everybody's best friend. It's not going to click with everybody. Sometimes there's just something between two people that it's not working out, and it's fine. And it's just either different viewpoint, different mindset, different approach. It could be a whole medley of things. So as much as relationships are important, I like the merry-go-round on, you don't want to be just stuck on the merry-go-round going in circles and not getting anywhere.
I'm in the 3/4 of the way done with this book called Quit. And it's all about exploring the concepts of like identity, sunk costs, fallacy, and sort of like grit, like persistence, where people realize like you no longer are making logical decisions in terms of how long you stay somewhere or how much money you commit to something. And it's really fascinating. Like, I wish I'd seen that book earlier. I don't know if it would have convinced me. I don't know if I was ready to, but it is really good to know that if you can know what you do really well and kind of own that, it helps you just move forward and realize like, oh, this person's just not going to see it. So they might not be able to convince this person. No harm, no foul, just go somewhere else. And I spent a lot of my career trying to prove to some people in another city that I was valuable, where like they were my Warner to my L.
Yeah. And if you can figure it out and let yourself know, okay, that's not going to work, and I need to be true to myself. Like, you don't want to, you talked also about shape shifting. You don't want to morph yourself into something else that's not you, that doesn't align with your values and goals. And yeah.
Self-awareness is a great thing. The earlier you can get it, the better.
Exactly. So, and you'll always be working on it. I feel like I learn something new about myself all the time. So
definitely.
But I wanted to thank you, Janki, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you.
If anybody has any questions for you or BD or wants to connect in Austin, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
The best way is always through LinkedIn. I try to be pretty active on it. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm really easy to find. And then we can start a conversation there, and then, take it off LinkedIn, because I'm not always great about the direct messages, but that's probably the easiest place to find me. You can also see me. I think I'm on the W. O'Neill website. So if you want to find out like who exactly I am or more about my company, you can look there too.
Yeah. And I will put the links down below, and also try to remember to grab the books and put them down below too that you mentioned. So if anybody's looking to improve their BD skills, check out the books we talked about today. But thank you again, Janki, for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you for asking me. This was like such a dream. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. Learn some advice to take with you and see how our industry is all tied together to create the world around us. Check out the description below for any links or resources we discussed. If you liked the episode, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. Give me a thumbs up and leave a comment below. It really helps others be able to discover this resource and support finding that career path that best works for them. If you know someone that has inspired your own career that you'd like me to interview, let me know in the comments below, or you can reach out to me via my website or LinkedIn. I'd be happy to share their story or your own. Thank you again, and I cannot wait for the next career story I get to share with you next week.